she got into the wrong carriage, and the Duke's stepsister immediately had a plan. My brother needs a wife. The London season unfolded with all the gilded splendor and brittle propriety one could imagine. Each ball and soirée a glittering stage upon which the city's elite performed their careful etiquette and whispered intrigues. It was in this world of gilt mirrors, flickering candlelight, and endless parade of gowns and powdered faces that Claire Vandy moved with an elegance born of necessity rather than choice. Though her posture was impeccable and her dresses meticulously arranged, Claire carried with her a quiet defiance, a mind alive with thought, a heart impatient for sincerity, and a spirit bristling against the relentless demands that a young woman's worth be measured by the width of her smile or the weight of her dowry. On that particular evening, the air within the grand ballroom of Lady Wexford's estate shimmered with heat and perfume. Laughter rang from the gilded galleries above, and the soft strains of a string quartet whispered beneath the hubbub of polite conversation. Women fluttered past in silks the color of rose petals, their fans flicking to punctuate delicate gossip, while men in black tailcoats leaned with practiced interest, appraising the society's newest acquisitions as though human beings were no more than curiosities to be collected. Claire, slender and poised, felt acutely the weight of every scrutinizing eye that swept over her, noting the precise curve of her wrist or the way the dim light caught the delicate jewelry at her throat. She had learned to navigate these eyes with careful amusement, to respond with the perfect tilt of her head, the courteous smile that promised attention yet withheld intimacy. It was in the midst of this calculated performance that the Earl of Haverford, a man whose age was marked by thinning hair and whose manners had been eroded by arrogance, decided to impose upon her evening. His attention was neither flattering nor subtle. It was invasive, a deliberate disregard for the invisible boundaries that separated polite acquaintance from unwelcome obsession. He approached with the slow confidence of someone convinced that his station permitted him to overstep. "Miss Vandy," he intoned, his voice a low hum of entitlement, "surely a lady of your intelligence could amuse an older gentleman such as myself with a word or two of wit?" Claire's stomach tightened and a flush rose to her cheeks, not of embarrassment at her own thought but at the audacity of his presumption. She had heard the gossip, of course, how men like him moved through the season, collecting whispers of attention from young ladies who had no recourse but to comply. Yet she was neither compliant nor silent. Her lips parted to offer a measured refusal, but before words could escape, he leaned closer, the scent of tobacco and overconfidence invading her senses. Every polite smile she had worn as armor seemed suddenly insufficient, every practiced gesture of courtesy now hollow against the looming threat of scandal. Her pulse quickened, and instinct seized her before reason could intervene. She stepped backward, her gloved hand brushing against a silk gown as she made for the side door, hoping to escape the prying eyes and the audacious hand that might follow her. The ballroom, which had moments before seemed a stage of controlled elegance, became a labyrinth of glancing guests and murmured speculation. Claire felt the familiar sting of humiliation. So easily in the eyes of society, one misstep, one faltering breath, and a young woman's reputation could be called into question. The Earl's gaze tracked her with predatory precision, and she realized with a jolt that discretion alone would not suffice. It was then, by happenstance or providence, that her flight led her to a waiting carriage, its polished surface gleaming in the lamplight and horses stamping impatiently. Without a moment's hesitation, and without regard for whose carriage it might be, Claire flung open the door and slid inside. The seat was cool beneath her skirts, the scent of lavender and fine leather mingling in the confined space. Relief washed over her, brief and fragile, until a voice, lively, amused and entirely unrestrained, broke the silence. "You do realize, of course, that you are seated in the wrong carriage?" the voice said, warm and teasing, yet carrying a subtle command that Claire could not ignore. Claire turned her gaze to meet the eyes of Laura Harding, a young woman with an irrepressible spark and an air of daring that bordered on recklessness. Laura's gaze appraised her not with judgment, but with curiosity, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared circumstance and perhaps of kindred spirit. Claire, still catching her breath, realized that she had stumbled into not merely a vehicle, but a potential ally in the treacherous theater of the London season. Laura's laughter, a light, melodious sound, seemed to deflate the tension that had clung to Claire like a second skin. "You look as though you have seen a ghost," Laura said, her eyes dancing. "Or perhaps an earl. Either way you have chosen wisely. My horses have the manners to carry one safely away from danger." As the carriage began to move, Claire allowed herself a small, tentative smile. She was still flushed, her dignity slightly bruised, but a flicker of relief kindled in her chest. In Laura's presence she felt the first glimmer of camaraderie, a promise that wit and bravery might yet find their place in a world that valued neither. The journey was short but revealing. Claire learned, in the quiet exchange of words and glances, that Laura Harding was not merely a companion of convenience. She was bold, clever, and entirely unafraid of the whispers that swirled through the corridors of London society. And in Laura's confident presence, Claire recognized a reflection of her own latent audacity, a courage that had been tempered by necessity but not extinguished. By the time the carriage returned to the edge of the city's bustling streets, the threat of the Earl seemed to recede, though not entirely vanish. Claire's cheeks were still tinged with embarrassment, her pulse still dancing to the rhythm of narrowly avoided scandal. Yet within her, a spark had been kindled, a recognition that in a world so governed by appearances, alliances forged in accident, or in courage, might prove more potent than any dowry or polite smile. Laura disembarked first, her steps measured but confident, and turned back to regard Claire with a knowing glance. "Fear not, Miss Vandy. The season is long and there are worse fates than an unwanted suitor. Come walk with me. There is much to be learned in a city that judges so harshly." Claire, summoning the remnants of her poise, rose and followed, the faint rustle of her skirts a whisper of defiance against the conventions that sought to bind her. In that moment, as the gas lamps of London flickered and the night deepened, she understood that the season would demand much of her, wits, courage and careful navigation of both men and society. Yet she also felt, perhaps for the first time, that there existed the possibility of a companion who might see her for more than her outward appearance. And so, amid the shadows and the murmurs of the London season, Claire Vandy stepped into the uncertain night, her dignity bruised but her spirit unbroken, unaware that this chance encounter would mark the beginning of a journey that would test her heart, her intellect, and the very rules that had sought to define her. The city lay before her, opulent, perilous and full of whispered promises, and somewhere within its grand houses and hidden alleys, her story was beginning to unfold. The morning after their chance encounter, Claire Vandy found herself walking beside Laura Harding through the narrow, cobbled streets of Mayfair, the early sun casting pale reflections on rain-slicked stone and gilded shop windows. There was a vibrancy to Laura's step, a careless grace that belied the rigid expectations of her world. Claire, still attuned to the bruising scrutiny of the previous evening, found it both exhilarating and disorienting to move through the city with someone so unrestrained, as if the very air around Laura dared to defy propriety. They spoke little at first, the silence punctuated by the clatter of carriage wheels and the distant calls of market sellers. Yet in those quiet moments Claire observed, with a keen eye, the subtle sway of Laura's confidence, the way her laughter seemed to invite rebellion against the cold formalities of their society. By the time they reached Laura's townhouse, the drawing rooms already filled with the scent of fresh roses and polished wood, it became clear that Laura's world was not merely one of elegance but of careful strategy. Over tea, with the sunlight gilding the china cups and casting long shadows across the polished table, Laura confessed her heart's burden. "Edward Grace," she said softly, her voice trembling only slightly despite her usual bravado, "he is everything a woman could hope for yet impossible. My stepbrother William, he monitors every acquaintance I keep. He believes he protects me, yet I feel imprisoned by his vigilance." Claire listened intently, recognizing in Laura's words a mirror of her own constrained existence, though the stakes differed. Laura leaned closer, lowering her voice as though the walls themselves were eager listeners. "I have devised a plan," she admitted, her eyes gleaming with a mischievous yet desperate light. "If William were to experience the stirrings of love, perhaps he would recognize the justice of my own heart. And perhaps I need you, Claire, unwitting though it may be, to bring this to pass." Claire's brow furrowed. The notion of manipulating the affections of another, especially a man of such dignity and authority as William, Duke of Windsor, felt audacious, almost perilous. Yet beneath the initial apprehension was a spark of intrigue, a recognition that her intellect and judgment could play a role in bending the rigid expectations that otherwise ruled their lives. She realized too that Laura's scheme was not born of selfishness alone. It was a calculated risk, a dance along the sharp edge of propriety in a society where a single misstep could destroy reputation. "Very well," Claire said at last, her voice measured, "but we shall proceed with honesty as far as the circumstances allow. I will not deceive him with artifice that sullies the heart." Laura's eyes lit with relief, and for a moment, the world seemed suspended between two possibilities: daring and ruin, courage and scandal. The days that followed were a careful choreography of appearances and subtle provocations. Claire attended the exhibitions, garden tours, and evening soirees favored by London's elite, where every conversation, Every gesture carried weight far beyond its immediate significance. She observed William for signs of the rare vulnerability Laura promised might exist beneath his composed exterior. The first meeting orchestrated by Laura was set in the hushed, solemn halls of the Historical Preservation Society, where candlelight flickered across oak beams and the faint aroma of wax and old parchment lingered in the air. It was here that Claire and William conversed at length, their words an elegant interweaving of intellect and mutual curiosity. They spoke of architecture, of the stately homes that held the echoes of centuries, of preservation and duty, of the careful stewardship required to maintain both history and honor. William's voice, deep and resonant, carried the gravity of a man who bore immense responsibility yet harbored an unspoken loneliness. Claire, in turn, allowed herself glimpses of candid thought, sharing her own admiration for artistry and her longing for a life not merely dictated by circumstance. Their dialogue, rich and nuanced, created a bond that was more than social politeness. It was a meeting of minds, subtle and dangerous in its intimacy. Yet amid this rising connection, society's gaze remained relentless. Rumors stirred as observers noted the frequent proximity of Claire and William, whispers that danced through salons and drawing rooms like wildfire. Each encounter carried a dual weight, the thrill of shared understanding and the looming shadow of potential scandal. Claire's heart pounded with each glance William bestowed, the tension sharpened by her knowledge that their proximity had been arranged by another, a deliberate act that complicated every sincere emotion. She wrestled with her conscience, understanding that the foundation of this bond was partially constructed upon Laura's manipulation, yet it felt undeniably alive, vibrant, and capable of true affection. Tokens of attention began to appear, subtle yet laden with significance. A handkerchief, embroidered with initials, placed inadvertently upon her chair, a book left upon her doorstep with a carefully noted passage on architecture and morality, a fleeting touch during the guided tour of stately homes that lingered longer than propriety permitted. Each gesture was a conversation in itself, an unspoken acknowledgement of interest that both thrilled and terrified Claire. She found herself dissecting every expression, every phrase, every pause, seeking the line between genuine emotion and societal performance. It was during one such gathering held in a private garden lit by lanterns swaying in the evening breeze, that the tension reached a new height. William, unaware of Laura's orchestration, spoke at length with Claire about the delicate balance between duty and desire, of the burdens that weighed upon those of rank, and of the isolation inherent in a life circumscribed by both privilege and expectation. His eyes, steady and searching, seemed to probe not only her intellect but the very integrity of her heart. Claire, caught between admiration, fear, and a growing affection, realized with a jolt that the scheme she participated in had begun to spin beyond the control of any one person. Scandal, subtle and insidious, crept ever closer. A misplaced word, a fleeting glance, a servant's hushed observation, all threatened to unravel both the carefully arranged circumstances and the nascent connection between Claire and William. And yet, within the risk, there existed an undeniable exhilaration. To challenge the rigid codex of society with courage and cleverness, to engage in the slow, deliberate game of hearts and minds, was a thrill that pulsed through Claire's veins. By the evening's end, as the lanterns cast dancing shadows over hedges and fountains, Claire found herself standing beside Laura once more. The air was fragrant with night-blooming flowers, the sky a deep violet canvas embroidered with the first stars of night. Laura's gaze met hers with a mixture of mischief and quiet pride. "You see, Claire," she murmured, "sometimes it is the smallest token, the most delicate scandal, that turns the course of hearts." Claire allowed herself a faint smile, understanding both the peril and the potential of the path before her. In the flickering light, she glimpsed the beginnings of possibility, a connection with William that felt sincere, though tempered by circumstance and intrigue. The city stretched before her, a landscape of opportunity and danger, and she knew that the coming days would test her courage, judgment, and perhaps, the very nature of her heart. And so, as carriages rolled over wet cobblestones and the distant strains of music faded into night, Claire Vandy felt the first stirrings of something profound, the intertwining of intellect, courage, and desire in a world that sought to measure her by the narrowest of standards. She understood that the rising scandal, the tokens of attention, and the delicate orchestration of hearts were not merely games of society, but the first steps in a journey that might lead to the most genuine of connections, a love forged not by circumstance alone, but by honesty, bravery, and the shared recognition of the soul's quiet truths. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall, mullioned windows of the Windsor Estate's library, casting long golden stripes across the polished oak floor and the rows of leather-bound volumes that lined the walls. Claire Vandy stood near the hearth, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she held a letter she had written the night before, a missive that contained every truth she had hitherto concealed. The quiet of the room was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of turning pages and the distant murmur of servants attending to the estate's less visible duties. Yet within this serene setting, Claire's heart hammered with the weight of the revelation she was about to deliver, for honesty in a world governed by appearances could be as dangerous as any scandal. William, Duke of Windsor, entered at precisely the moment when the light fell upon Claire's anxious face, his expression composed, almost austere, yet betraying a faint curiosity that softened the edges of his rigid demeanor. His presence alone seemed to fill the room, commanding attention without effort, a reminder of the authority he carried in every chamber and hall he occupied. Claire drew a slow, steadying breath, aware that each word she uttered would either fortify or fracture the fragile bond that had been growing between them over weeks of cautious conversation and shared observation. "Claire," William began, his voice measured, carrying the calm weight of someone accustomed to maintaining control over both estate and emotion. "You wish to speak with me alone?" There was no impatience in his tone, yet the subtle firmness implied that truth, once uttered, could not be easily withdrawn. Claire nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line to suppress the quiver that threatened to betray her. "Yes, Your Grace," she said softly, "there is something I must confess, something that concerns both my own conduct and the circumstances that have brought us into acquaintance." She paused, gathering her courage, aware that the room's silence had taken on a palpable tension, as though the very walls anticipated the weight of her words. William inclined his head slightly, his expression inviting yet cautious. "Proceed," he said, the single word carrying both authority and patience. Claire's voice, though measured, trembled at the edges. "Our first meetings, the conversations we have shared, the moments in which we discovered common interest and mutual regard, they were influenced in part by my friend Laura Harding. She orchestrated our encounters, believing that by doing so, she might sway your understanding regarding her own heart's desire." She swallowed hard, the taste of apprehension bitter on her tongue. "I did not deceive you intentionally, Your Grace, but I participated, knowing her plan and the hope it contained." William's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, a shadow of surprise crossing his otherwise controlled features. "You were complicit?" he asked, his tone restrained yet carrying a quiet sting. "You allowed yourself to be a pawn in another's design?" Claire's gaze met his, steady now despite the pounding of her pulse. "I did, sir. But my feelings, my admiration and respect for you are genuine. I have come to value our conversations, your insight, and the rare openness you grant in moments of candor. Nothing in my heart has been feigned, save for the circumstances that introduced us." She lifted her hand, trembling slightly, and pressed the letter she had written to the polished surface of a side table, as if it might anchor her sincerity. A silence fell between them, heavy and suffused with the weight of revelation. William's eyes, dark and contemplative, traced the elegant contours of her face, noting the faint flush on her cheeks, the slight quiver of her lips, the unspoken courage behind her confession. His own emotions, though seldom displayed, stirred like a distant tide, revealing a vulnerability rarely witnessed by any but his closest confidants. "Do you understand, Claire?" he said finally, his voice lower now, threaded with a complexity that seemed almost foreign in its softness, "the risk you have undertaken by speaking thus? In our society, such honesty might be construed as impropriety or worse, naivety exploited for convenience." "I do, Your Grace," Claire replied firmly, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "And yet, I could not allow our connection to rest upon anything other than truth. To pretend, to conceal would dishonor both my feelings and yours. I would rather face disapproval than allow deceit to govern my heart." William remained silent for a long moment, pacing slowly to the window, where he stared out at the gardens beyond, the sunlight casting his shadow across the floor. Claire followed his movements with careful attention, noting the subtle furrow in his brow, the tension in his shoulders. This was a man accustomed to authority, to control, yet here he confronted a truth that even he could not command or contain. "You speak with such conviction," he said at last, turning to her with eyes that glimmered with a mixture of admiration and restrained astonishment. "And yet I cannot deny the turmoil this revelation brings. I feel unmoored, as though the very ground upon which I have measured propriety has shifted beneath me." Claire took a cautious step forward, her gloved hands clasped before her. "It is not my intent to unsettle you, Your Grace. I only ask that you understand the sincerity of my heart, and that the circumstances of our meeting do not diminish the regard and respect I hold for you. Everything I feel is genuine, untainted by pretense or artifice." William's gaze softened, and he regarded her with a quiet intensity that made Claire's breath catch. "You surprise me, Claire Vandy. To confess such truth, unshielded by evasions or half-measures, is rare." He paused, as if weighing the depth of his own response before continuing. "I had believed myself immune to sentiment, careful to govern both mind and heart with measured reason. And yet, your honesty, your courage, it stirs something I had long suppressed." Claire's pulse quickened, hope and fear entwining in equal measure. She realized that in the act of confession she had risked not only her own dignity but the fragile possibility of connection, and now that possibility quivered on the edge of realization. "I do not presume, Your Grace, to demand forgiveness for my complicity," she said softly. "But I trust that you will judge my intentions by the truth of my feelings, not merely by the circumstances that led us here." William stepped closer, the faint warmth of his presence encroaching upon the measured distance she had maintained. "Claire, you have demonstrated a rare integrity. I see now that your heart has been unerring, even when your steps were guided by another. That is a quality I cannot dismiss lightly." His words, carefully chosen, yet carrying an undeniable weight, made Claire's chest swell with tentative relief. In that moment, as the sun cast a final amber glow across the room, Claire understood that the fragile bridge between suspicion and trust had begun to solidify. William, though initially wounded by the revelation, was beginning to recognize the authenticity of her character, the courage in her candor, and the depth of feeling that had emerged despite the artifice that had brought them together. She allowed herself a faint, grateful smile, and he inclined his head in acknowledgement, a silent promise that the story between them was far from concluded, yet now anchored in the first firm foundation of truth. Outside the library, the city carried on in its customary rhythm, unaware of the quiet revolution that had occurred within these walls, a confession that might yet shape the course of hearts, honor, and love. And so, with tension diffused yet unresolved, Claire and William found themselves on the threshold of understanding, the delicate balance of society, sentiment, and sincerity hanging in perfect equilibrium. In that shared silence, each recognized that the journey forward would demand both patience and courage, for the path to genuine affection had been revealed, but the trials of propriety and expectation had only just begun. The grand dining hall of the Windsor estate glimmered beneath the soft radiance of 100 flickering candles, each flame reflected in the polished silver and crystal that adorned the table. The evening was warm with the murmured laughter of family and guests, the rustle of silk skirts and the subtle clinking of glasses forming a symphony of civility. Yet beneath the veneer of refinement, attention pulsed, delicate and electric, as if the very walls were attuned to the long-suppressed truths and unspoken desires that hovered among those present. Claire Vandy, seated beside Laura Harding, adjusted the lace at her wrist with a careful grace, her heart beating a rapid rhythm beneath the calm mask she presented. This was a gathering unlike any other. Tonight intentions would be made clear and hearts would either be sealed or rent. Across the table William, Duke of Windsor, observed Claire with a measured intensity, noting the subtle warmth of her gaze and the quiet confidence she now carried, a composure born from honesty and courage. Their past confessions, the whispered uncertainties, and the intricate dance of propriety and desire had all culminated in this moment. He understood that the delicate threads of trust had been woven by their shared sincerity, and now he faced the singular opportunity to declare not only his regard but the readiness of his heart to embrace what had emerged between them. The meal proceeded with careful etiquette, servants gliding silently among the guests, pouring wine, adjusting silverware, and maintaining the illusion of effortless grandeur. Conversation flowed around them, talk of art exhibitions, the latest philanthropic endeavors, and the subtle gossip that always accompanied such assemblies, but within the sphere of Claire and William, an unspoken dialogue took precedence. Every glance, every carefully measured gesture, carried weight far beyond the polite civility of the hall. Claire felt the warmth of his attention like a flame brushing against her consciousness, a reminder of the vulnerability inherent in the truths they had shared. Laura, ever perceptive, leaned toward Edward Grace, her voice a low murmur of amusement and reassurance. The young couple's hands touched briefly beneath the table, a silent affirmation of mutual affection that had weathered both William's watchful oversight and the subtle machinations of society. In observing their quiet triumph, Claire felt a mixture of relief and anticipation, realizing that the obstacles facing her own heart, though formidable, were not insurmountable. Courage, honesty, and the acknowledgement of one's desires could yet triumph over the rigid expectations that had constrained them all. William, rising slightly from his chair, drew the attention of the room with the authority inherent in his station. Conversations dwindled, and a hush settled, broken only by the faint rustle of skirts and the distant murmur of the wind outside the grand windows. Claire felt her pulse quicken, the air between them thick with anticipation. William's gaze found hers, steady and unwavering, and in that silent moment, the weight of every confession, every tender gesture, and every shared glance converged upon them both. "Claire Vandy," he began, his voice measured yet imbued with a warmth that drew all ears, "in these past weeks, I have come to understand the integrity and courage with which you navigate the expectations of our society. You have revealed your heart with honesty, a quality so rare that it commands respect beyond the bounds of ordinary admiration. I have watched, listened, and learned of your steadfastness, your wit, and the sincerity that underlies every action you take. It is clear to me that any attempt to conceal my own sentiments would be a disservice to both my conscience and the truth we have discovered together." Claire's breath caught, her eyes glistening with emotion. She had long feared that her confession might fracture the fragile connection between them, that William's dignity and the weight of propriety might outweigh his recognition of her heart. Yet here he stood, a figure of authority and measured composure, yet entirely unguarded in his acknowledgement of the depth she had stirred within him. "I wish to speak plainly," William continued, stepping closer, the soft candlelight gilding the dark waves of his hair and the fine cut of his coat. "Claire, my regard for you has grown into something that cannot be dismissed by circumstance or expectation. I ask you now, in the sight of family and those whose judgment matters little in matters of the heart, will you consent to bind your life with mine, not merely by duty or arrangement, but by choice, by mutual respect, and by the affection that has been proven true through honesty and courage?" Tears, unchecked, glimmered in Claire's eyes, and she rose from her seat, the faint rustle of her skirts a whisper against the polished floor. "Yes, your grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the flood of emotion. "Yes, I consent with all the truth and fervor of my heart. Nothing in this world could compel me to act otherwise." A murmur of astonishment and delight swept through the room as William extended his hand, and Claire placed hers within it, the contact a quiet yet undeniable seal of their union. Their eyes met, and in that moment all the fears, all the manipulations and all the uncertainties of the London season were eclipsed by the certainty of their shared affection. It was a victory not of societal performance but of truth and courage, a triumph born from the deliberate choice to honor the heart above all else. Laura and Edward, observing the scene, exchanged a private smile, their own love now fully recognized and sanctioned by William's approval. The stepsisters' plan, intricate and audacious, had succeeded beyond the mere orchestration of encounters. It had revealed the capacity for trust, integrity, and affection to flourish even amid the rigid confines of 1800s society. Laura's eyes met Claire's across the table, a silent acknowledgement of both their alliance and the triumph of their collective courage. The evening progressed with the subtle, graceful ease of celebrations well-timed. Toasts were offered, polite laughter resumed, and the warmth of familial pride mingled with the personal victories of heart and conscience. Yet for Claire and William, the night held a private resonance that no observation, no gossip, and no display of grandeur could diminish. Every glance, every subtle gesture, carried the weight of shared trials, confessions, and mutual understanding. A year passed, and the Windsor estate reflected not merely wealth and tradition but the quiet contentment that accompanies fulfilled hearts. Claire and William were married, their union blessed not by mere propriety but by the sincerity of their affection, and they welcomed a son whose presence symbolized the promise of a lineage grounded in courage, honesty, and the deliberate pursuit of happiness. Laura and Edward, too, thrived in their love, their bond now free from the constraints that once seemed insurmountable. In the stillness of the estate's library, where sunlight danced upon shelves of aged volumes and the laughter of a child echoed faintly through open windows, Claire often reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She understood that love in their society was rarely pure, rarely free from intrigue, expectation, or danger. Yet she also knew that by embracing truth, exercising courage, and acknowledging the heart's quiet urgencies, a love both resilient and tender could emerge. It was not perfect, for perfection was an illusion the world often demanded, but it was authentic, built from the delicate interplay of mistakes, revelations, and the unwavering decision to follow one's conscience. As evening fell over the estate, casting long shadows across manicured gardens and grand halls, Claire stood at a window, holding her son in her arms. William, by her side, offered a quiet reassurance with a hand upon her shoulder, their proximity a testament to trust earned and affections nurtured. She knew, with a calm certainty, that they had forged a love that transcended the superficiality of social expectation, a love that endured because it had been chosen deliberately, honestly, and courageously. And so, amid the grandeur, the whispered intrigues, and the gilded expectations of 1800s London, the Vandy-Windsor union stood as a quiet beacon of what could be achieved when hearts were brave enough to speak, when truth was embraced despite risk, and when love was honored for its depth rather than its convenience. The city might continue its relentless judgments, the season its endless parades of beauty and propriety, but within the walls of the Windsor estate, love had triumphed, not in spectacle but in steadfast sincerity, resilience, and the profound courage of two hearts committed to one another. Ultimately, this story concludes with the message that true love is never perfect, but is built through honesty, courage, and trust of the heart. It is not a tale of love that is always easy, but a story of hearts choosing each other, even along the hardest paths.